one goal, and that's to keep both you and me alive. Maybe if I can do that long enough, we'll actually have a reasonable expectation of life beyond the next 24 to 48
Hello there,
hours.
and welcome to this
Should we ever be in that happy position,
first hole.
I can think about having other
Let's have
goals.
a bit of fun here,
Goals imply a future. His frown spread from his mouth to his eyes, his brows pushed down and together. Are things really that bad? Yes, she exploded, her hands clenching into fists. She took a deep breath. I thought that was obvious, too. The sun was setting. They should have been on the move 5 minutes ago. She jumped down from the Humvee and whistled for the dogs. Einstein bounded past her eagerly, ready to be back on the road. She went to pick up Lola, but Daniel was there first. Alex stretched and tried to focus. She felt decently rested and would probably be fine driving all night. That was all that mattered.
Great contact.
Just
nice
making it through the night without garnering any more attention than she had to. Sending Kevin's email, and then getting her little traveling circus into a less flamboyant vehicle. That was the limit of her ambition.
145 yards out.
They drove in silence for a while. It got dark while they were still on back roads. When they eased onto I-49, Alex relaxed a little. There hadn't been very many cars, and everything they had seen was old and fit the countryside. For now, she was fairly certain that no one knew exactly where they were. She knew she should be concentrating, but the dark road with the steady flow of anonymous traffic was monotonous, and she couldn't help wondering what Daniel was thinking. It wasn't like him to be so quiet. She thought about turning on the radio, but that felt sort of cowardly. She probably owed him an apology. I'm sorry if I was rough back there, she said, the words sounding very loud after the long lull. I'm not good at this people stuff. There's really no excuse for
Solid
me.
swing.
I'm a full-grown adult. I should be able to hold a normal conversation. Sorry. His sigh didn't sound exasperated. It was more like
I think
relief.
you could probably two-putt from here. Okay,
No,
11-footer here.
I'm
this
the
is
one
definitely
who's sorry.
makeable.
I shouldn't have pushed. My lack of focus landed us in this position. I will get it together. She shook her head. You can't think of it that way. You're not responsible for this. Look, someone has decided to kill you. It happened to Kevin 6 months ago, and it happened to me a few years before that. You'll make mistakes because it's impossible to know what is or isn't a mistake until it's made. But mistakes don't mean you're guilty for what is happening. Never forget that there was a real human being who decided to put his agenda ahead of
Even
your
par
existence.
After the first hole.
He thought about that for a minute. I know what you're saying. I believe it, but
let's let her rip.
I need to listen to you more closely. Act like you. Keep my mind on what matters. It doesn't help us to have me mooning around like a teenager, worrying about whether or not you like me. Honestly, Daniel, No, he interrupted immediately. I did not mean to hijack this conversation with that comment. I just want to explain. If you're a teenager, I'm a toddler. I'm emotionally backward, defective even. I don't know how to do any of this, and while survival is obviously the priority, I'm also using it to deflect questions I should be able to answer. I mean, love? I don't even know what that is, or if it's real.
Nice.
Sorry,
Should be in the
it's
fairway.
just foreign to me. I evaluate things based on needs and wants. I can't deal with anything fluffier. Daniel laughed his funny laugh, and all the tension bled right out of her. She laughed with him, and then sighed. Everything felt less awful when she could laugh along with Daniel. He released one final chuckle, then said lightly, So, tell me what you need. She thought it through. I need you to be alive, and I would like to be alive too. That's my baseline. If I get more than that, I would prefer to have you close by. After that, anything else is just frosting. Call me an optimist, but I think we may just be dealing with nothing more than some semantic issues here. You could be right. If we get a few more weeks together, maybe we'll figure out how to speak the same language. He took her hand. I've always been a quick study with linguistics. Chapter 22. Alex chose the gas station outside Baton Rouge based on the age of the cashier. He was 80 if he was a day, and she had high hopes that his
Heading
vision
for the
and hearing
green
were
here.
past their prime. Once she
Yes, sir.
ascertained that he was paying her
Okay, for the
absolutely
birdie.
no attention at all, despite the fact that her thick makeup was far from convincing, she did some thorough shopping. More water, lots of nuts and jerky, any kind of non-perishable protein she could find. She grabbed some cans of V8, though she wasn't a fan, as the convenience store didn't have a fresh produce section. She acknowledged to herself that she would have to go to an actual grocery store at some point, but she hoped they could wait it out a bit longer. Every day her bruises faded a little more. There was no drama at the 24-hour internet coffee place either. It was near the university, so it had no shortage of late-night seat fillers. She kept her hood up and her face down, sat in a secluded corner, and asked for a plain black coffee without looking at the barista who came for her order. She wished she had time to do this from somewhere not on the trail to their destination, but the first priority had to be exchanging the Batmobile. It was
And
currently
that'll
her
keep
biggest
you
disadvantage.
at even par. Nice.
She created a brand new email account registered to a name that was
Here we
no
go.
more than a random
this in the
combination
fairway.
of letters and numbers. Then she tried to channel Kevin. You should have left it alone, Devers. You shouldn't have involved a civilian. I'm not here to do your dirty work, but I took care of the little interrogator for you. Texas was a nice way to say you're welcome. Enough is enough. Not a specific threat, but plenty implied. She hesitated for a second with her finger over the mouse, the little arrow touching the send button. Was she giving them anything they didn't have? They would know by now that Daniel wasn't among the dead back at the ranch.
You smashed
She
that.
couldn't try to fool Devers on that point. Was there some way she wasn't seeing for this to come back at them? Could this make things worse? She hit the button.
I'd say it looks like
Things
around
couldn't get that
145
much worse
yards
anyway.
from the pin.
As soon as it was sent, she was on her feet. The Humvee was parked in the alley around the back, behind a couple of dumpsters. She walked quickly with her head down, hood up, and a syringe in hand. The side street was mostly empty, just one small knot of people huddled close together in the darkness of a recessed emergency door. She studied the trio for a second before she climbed into the dark vehicle. Einstein touched his nose to her shoulder. Daniel took her hand. Do you know where the night vision goggles are? She murmured. He dropped her hand. Is something wrong? He whispered back.
Nice.
He turned to rummage between
Okay,
the
we're
seats.
putting from around
Nothing
15
new,
feet out.
she promised. Maybe something helpful. He handed her the goggles. She switched them on and took a better look at the little conference. It was just breaking up. This wasn't a particularly rough area of town, and all three participants were expensively dressed, though their clothes were casual. A dark-haired man was holding hands with a blonde girl who had so many showy labels on the different pieces of clothing she wore
Yes.
that she looked like a NASCAR driver sponsored by mid-level luxury brands.
1 under for the
These
round.
two were walking off now, their path angling away from the Humvee. The blonde bobbled and swayed
Nice
a little as she
bird on
walked.
that last hole.
The man
Let's see
with her
another
was
one.
stuffing something into the pocket of his hoodie. The third person stayed in the dark doorframe, leaning against it casually, like he was expecting more guests soon. His clothing was what she would describe as upmarket frat boy. She thought about what she'd just been feeling inside the cafe before she pushed send, that things couldn't get much worse. She supposed there were ways this spontaneous idea of hers could go south, but she couldn't think of any that she wouldn't be able to handle quietly. And it would be a big help
Looking
if the
good.
frat boy was what she thought he was. She pulled the goggles off. Where's the cash? She whispered. 30 seconds later,
This
syringe
is
in
for
one
Birdie.
hand and roll of 50s in the other, she slid quietly from the Humvee and walked toward the man, who was still relaxed against the wall, like there was no place he'd rather be. She couldn't see very clearly without the goggles, but she thought she caught his minimal reaction when he realized she was approaching him. His body stiffened just slightly, but he didn't move. Hello, she said, when she was close enough that she could speak quietly and still be sure he could hear. Evening, he responded in a lazy southern drawl. I was wondering if you could help me. I'm looking for a specific product. Her inflection went up on the end, like it was a question. She didn't know how to buy drugs off the street. She'd never had to do it before. This was the first time the supplies she'd been able to amass during her time in Chicago
And that'll
had
keep
run
you at
dry.
1 under for the round.
Joey G never minded paying in product. She expected that the frat boy would accuse her of
Okay,
being a
let's send
cop,
this little ball
like
on
dealers
its
always
way.
did on TV. But he just nodded. I might be able to help. What are you looking for? It was unlikely he was a cop, unless the sale she'd just watched had been faked to draw a real customer in. If he tried to arrest her, she'd knock him out and escape. A manhunt in Baton Rouge would hardly be her biggest problem, and she knew he couldn't see her face well. He hadn't reacted to the damage. Opioids, opium or heroin or morphine. There was a pause as he peered into the darkness under her hood. She didn't think he was successful in seeing much.
That was launched.
Well, that's an exotic list. Opium? Huh. I have no idea where you could get that around here. Heroin will do just as well. I'd prefer the powdered form if possible. I don't suppose it's likely you'd have anything uncut? It was all but impossible that he would have pure heroin. Whatever he had would have been modified 2 or 3 times before it reached his hands. Not that he would tell her the truth. Purification was a bit of a pain, but she'd make the time. He laughed once, and she guessed her shopping style was probably not the norm. I've got some upscale stuff. It's not cheap, though. You get what you pay for, Alex said. I'm not looking for a deal. $200 a gram. Pure white powder. Sure it is, she thought to herself. But corrupted heroin was better than no heroin. 3 grams, please. He paused. Though it was too dark to really read his expression, she could tell what he wanted from the way he cocked his head to the side. She pulled the cash from her pocket and counted out 12 bills. She wondered for a second if he would try to steal the rest from her, but he seemed to be a businessman. He'd want an apparently affluent customer like her to become a regular client. He took the money she offered, looked it over quickly, then stowed it in the back pocket of his cargo shorts. She tensed when he crouched down, but he was just pulling a backpack out from behind a pile of garbage bags dumped against the wall. He didn't have to search for what he wanted. He was standing again a second later, holding out 3 small plastic bags. In the dark, she couldn't be positive about the color, but it looked close to white. She held out her hand, and he laid the bags on her palm. Thank you,
37-footer
said.
Here. Let's see what you can do.
My pleasure, ma'am. He did a funny little nod, almost a bow. Alex hurried back to the Humvee, glad that it was hard to make out from this angle. The dealer would see a large, dark-colored vehicle, and not much more than that. Einstein whined quietly as she climbed into the passenger seat. Let's go, she said. Daniel started the engine. Turn left down that side street so that guy won't get a good look at the Humvee. What just happened? Daniel whispered as he followed her instructions. Even in a whisper, the tension was easy to hear. No wonder the dog was anxious. Just picking up some ingredients I needed. Ingredients? I was out of opioids. As they moved out onto a wider road, Alex could feel his tension easing, probably due to her nonchalance. Was that a drug deal then? Yes. Remember what I said about bathtub chemistry? Getting my raw materials is a little more complicated than it used to be. I didn't want to pass up the opportunity.
And that'll keep you at 1 under.
It was
for the
quiet
round.
for a moment. I hope that was the right move, she muttered. You think you'll tell someone about
coming
us?
Up.
She blinked for a second. What? Oh, no, I'm not worried about the dealer. I was just thinking about sending that email. The email was Kevin's call, Daniel responded. She nodded. And he has a better batting average than I do. No, I just meant that if it goes south, it was his call. She laughed once. It was a heavy sound. You don't like it? I don't know. I want to finish this, but I'm tired, Daniel. I also want to run away and hide. That doesn't sound so bad, he agreed. Oh, if I was invited.
Nice.
She glanced at him, surprised. Of course. Good. There it was again. That automatic, of course. That crazy assumption that he would be present for whatever future she was allowed.
We have about
She didn't know if it was the wearing strain or something more, but an annoying feeling of presentiment haunted her for the rest of the night. Maybe it was just the jitters from finally getting her hands on some coffee for the first time in 2 days. She was almost shocked when, 7 hours later, and with the sun already well above the horizon, they reached the secluded cabin without incident. Daniel had taken them down only 2 wrong turns.
Nice swing.
Impressive, considering he hadn't been to the cabin since he was 10 years old. And all the roads they'd traveled after sunrise were empty. That meant no one could report seeing an armored vehicle in the
All right, we're
vicinity.
setting up 30 feet
She
from the
parked
hole.
the Humvee
so have
behind the
fun with
detached garage for the present. Daniel kicked a few rocks around the base of the stairs until he found the plastic one. He removed the concealed key and then walked up the porch steps with Einstein at his heels. Alex stood in front of the log cabin. It was a red cedar A-frame, charming, despite some evidence that it had been built in the 70s. So tired she couldn't move those last few steps. Though the night had been blessedly uneventful, it had still been a long time on the road. She'd traded seats with Daniel outside Baton Rouge, and then been too wired by the sense of apprehension that had troubled her since sending the email to relinquish control again. Daniel had napped off and on, and he seemed almost chipper now. He passed her to
And
go
that'll keep you
retrieve
at one
Lola from the
underhood
back of the Humvee. "You look like you might need to be carried too," he commented as he passed
Okay,
her
it's
again.
time to send this
time
ball
with
on
the
its
dog.
way.
He set Lola beside the door and then came back for Alex. "Give me a second," she mumbled. "Brain sleeping." "Just a few more steps," he encouraged. He put an arm around her waist and pulled her gently forward. Once she started moving, it was easier. Inertia got her up the stairs and through the front door. She only partially took in a high wall of triangular windows looking out over a swampy forest, aged but comfortable-looking couches, an old-fashioned wood-burning stove, and a
Looks
short
like
open
you're gonna
stairway
hit some sand
as he
here.
steered her past it all and down a compact
Well,
hallway.
you're in the sand, so
"The master is over here,
let's just
I
get out of
think.
there and
Kev and I always
move
got
on
the
with our
loft.
lives.
I'll unload and get the dog settled. Then I'll crash too." She nodded as he showed her into a dim room with a large iron bedstead. That was all she noticed before her head hit the pillow. "Poor darling," she heard Daniel chuckle as she sank into the dark. She came back to consciousness slowly, drifting up through layers of dreamy non-reality. She was comfortable and calm. Nothing had startled her awake.
Well, at
And
least
even
you're out of the
before she was
sand.
fully
Okay, looks
lucid,
like
she
about
was
18
aware of
feet
Daniel's
from here.
body warm beside her. A low, close thrumming caught her attention, but before the sound could frighten her, she felt the breeze of the oscillating fan move gently down the length of her body. She opened her eyes. It was still dim, but the light was a different color than it had been when she'd collapsed. It leaked in around the lined floral that covered the big window on the opposite wall. Early evening, not as hot as before. She must have been sweating earlier, but it was dried now, a film that felt stiff against the skin of her face. The room was made of long red logs, just like the outside. More light came from behind her. She rolled over and saw the skylight above the open vanity. Her backpack, her gas mask, and the first aid kit were by the sink.
Performance is gonna put
Daniel
you
might not
up
be a
to
natural
even
fugitive,
par.
but he was more thoughtful than anyone else she'd ever known.
Okay, here we go.
She tiptoed out to the hall and did some quick surveillance. The rest of the cabin was small, just a kitchen with an attached nook for a dining room, the living room with all the windows, the open loft above it, and a small second bedroom with a hall bath. She used that bath to take a quick, much-needed shower. There were shampoo and conditioner in the little blue shower tub combo, but no soap, so she used the shampoo as body wash. She was glad the soap was missing, just like she was glad the refrigerator was empty and that there was a
Great
fine layer of
contact.
dust on all the counters. No one had been in these rooms for a while. After she quickly applied new bandages to her face and examined her hands, which looked much better than she'd thought they would, she peeked through the long windows
right
beside
around
the front
200
door
yards
to
out.
check on the dogs. They were snoozing contentedly on the porch. She was getting used to the comfort of having an early alarm system. She was a little hungry, but felt too lazy to do anything about it right away. She remembered how it felt yesterday to wake up alone, and she didn't want Daniel to experience the same panic. She wasn't really sleepy anymore, but she was tired, and the bed still looked pretty good. It was probably avoidance. As long as she kept her eyes closed and her head on the pillow, she didn't have to start planning what needed to happen next. She returned to her earlier position, curled up against Daniel's chest, and let herself relax. There wasn't anything that she had to do immediately. 20 minutes of unthinking rest wasn't so much to ask, or even an hour. She'd gotten them here alive. She'd earned it. Unfortunately, not thinking was easier said than done. She found herself dwelling on the promise she'd made to Daniel that she wouldn't leave him behind. On the one hand, she knew she would never be satisfied with any long-distance arrangement for his safety. Even if she could stockpile a year's worth of food, even if she could be positive that the owners wouldn't come back, even if she could arm this place to vaporize any intruder, and even if she could lock Daniel inside like a prisoner so he couldn't wander off and find trouble, she would not
And with
be
that,
satisfied.
you will stay
Because
at Even Park.
what if? The hunters had found him
Hole
before,
number 9.
and she'd left a trail, albeit a faint one, to this place. She could take him north to her rental, but the department had contacted her while she was living there. She didn't think they knew her address, but what if? As long as Daniel stayed near her, she could do what was necessary to protect him, things he wouldn't think of himself. She could see the traps he wouldn't see. On the other hand, was that just her own wants talking? She wanted to be with Daniel. Was her mind coming up with proofs for that necessity? Was her logic flawed, twisting to accommodate her personal wishes? How could she be sure? When she'd told him before that it wasn't a good idea to have her liability close beside her while she went on the attack, she knew that was sound logic. Of course, if they got to him while she was far away, that distance wouldn't remove the hold they'd have on her. She sighed. How could she see clearly? Her emotions had tangled this whole situation into a knot of Gordian complexity. Still unconscious, Daniel shifted to wrap his arm around her. She knew what he would say about her dilemma, and she also knew that his perspective would not help her to see more clearly. He sighed, starting to stir. His fingers traced down the length of her spine, then slowly back up. They played with the wet fringes of hair on the back of her neck. He stretched with a groan, and then his hands were back in her hair. "You've been up," he murmured. His eyes opened slowly, blinking as they worked to focus. In the dusky room, they were dark gray. "It didn't stick," she answered. He laughed as his eyes slid shut again. He tucked her more tightly into his chest. "Good. What time is it?" "Around 4, I think." "Anything to worry about?" "No. Not for right now, at least."
You're on the green. Good stuff.
That's nice.
All right, 13-footer here.
It really is. "This is nice," he said. His hand traced back up her spine again, then trailed over her right shoulder, traced lightly across her collarbone, and finally curved around the good side of her face. He tilted it up until their noses touched. "Yes, this too," Alex agreed. "More than nice," he murmured, and she would have agreed, but he was kissing her. His hand on her face was soft, his lips soft.
There's a nice putt.
But the arm around her waist strained her tight against his chest. She wrapped her arms around his neck and held herself closer still. It wasn't like the car, where the pulse of the hunt had been loud in both their ears, when they were still shocked and panicking. There was no horror, just the rhythm of her heart and his, speeding without fear. She supposed it was inevitable, the way they'd been carrying on, that given a quiet place far away, for the moment, from any danger, with just the two of them together and no interruptions, there would be nothing to keep them apart any longer. The strange thing, then, was how it didn't feel at all inevitable. Somehow, it was the biggest surprise of her life. It was all a jumble of opposites tumbling together in a way that left her helpless to analyze any of them. Comfortable, familiar, but also electric and new.
Whoops.
Gentle at the same time.
So
it was
you're in the rough here.
extreme,
Not gonna lie.
both soothing and overwhelming. It was like every nerve ending in her body was lit up with dozens of conflicting stimuli simultaneously. All she was really sure of was the Danielness of him, that core of something pure, something better than anything she'd known before. He belonged to a more excellent world than the one where she resided, and while they were part of each other, she felt like she was allowed to be there with him. She knew her past experience with relationships was quite limited by most people's standards.
Solid swing.
So she didn't have much to compare this to. She'd always thought of sex as a single event that had a defined end, an effort at physical gratification that sometimes satisfied and
Looking at
sometimes
a
did not.
19-foot putt from here.
This experience didn't fit into the same category on any level. It was less an event and more an ongoing exploration of each other, a satisfaction of curiosity, a fascination over each little detail discovered. It wasn't about gratification, but there was no need that wasn't met, whether it was physical or something less definable. She searched for the right word as they lay kissing quietly, patiently now, with the light turning red around the edges of the curtain. She wasn't sure what to label this emotion that filled her so entirely that she thought it might stretch her skin. It was a little like that bubbly feeling that had left her smiling at the thought of him,
that was
but
just
multiplied
awesome.
by
Huge
thousands,
putt.
millions,
Okay,
and then
1 under for the
fired in a
round.
crucible until every impurity, every lesser sensation was burned out,
Okay, next stop,
leaving
fairway,
only this
right?
behind. She didn't have a name for it. The closest she could think of was joy. "I love you," he whispered against her lips. "I love you." Maybe that was the word. She just never thought its definition could be so huge. "Daniel," she murmured. "You don't have to say anything back. I just needed to say that out loud. I might have exploded had I tried to keep it in. I will probably have to say it again soon. You are forewarned." He laughed. She
Solid
smiled.
swing.
"I never want to go back to having nothing to lose. I'm glad I have you as my liability. I'm grateful. I'd have you as anything." She laid her head against his
Okay,
chest
you're
and
about
listened to his
140
breath
yards out
moving
here.
in and out. For so long now, breathing had been her priority. If she could have spoken to the woman she was even just a month ago, she knew that woman would have been terrified of expanding that priority to include another set of lungs. That woman would have run away from needing anything more than her own life. But what she would have missed. Alex couldn't even remember what she'd been holding on to back then.
Nice.
This was the kind of life worth fighting to keep. I think I was probably 12, maybe 13, when I sort of gave up on living an extraordinary life. He mused thoughtfully, running his
Sitting
fingers in
at 2
aimless
under for
patterns
the
through her
round.
hair. That's probably about the age that everyone starts to grow up and
Let's
leave
put this
fantasy
ball
behind.
down in the fairway.
You realize you're never going to discover that you're actually an alien, adopted by those prosaic human parents with amazing superpowers that will save the world. He chuckled. I mean, you know that much earlier, but you can't quite let go. Not for years. And then the world beats you down a little, and some of the color goes out of life, and you settle for reality. I think I did a decent job of it. I found plenty of happiness in the drab, everyday world, but
Ooh.
I want you to know,
Fairway bunker.
this time with you,
get it back on the fairway? Do you try
has
to
been
make up some
extraordinary.
distance? Up to you.
There has been terror, yes, but along with it, there's been a kind of joy I didn't know existed. And it's because you are extraordinary. I'm so glad you found me. My life was destined to change drastically, it seems, in one way or another. I'm just so grateful that it got to be with you. Her throat was tight, and she marveled as she blinked furiously to keep the moisture in her eyes from pooling. She'd cried in grief, in pain, in loneliness, and even in fear. But this was the first time in her life she'd had
swing.
tears of joy in her eyes. It seemed a strange response, something she'd never truly taken at face value when she'd read about it. This was the first time she'd understood that
Well, you're out of
joy
the
could
sand.
be even
That's
more
all,
severe than
all you
pain.
can ask for.
She would happily have never left the bed, but eventually they had to eat. Daniel didn't complain, but she could tell he would be pleased when he had access to real food again. It was strange, as they sat at the little table in the alcove eating jerky, peanuts, and chocolate chip cookies, laughing and scratching the dog's ears. Of course they'd caved quickly and brought Einstein and Lola inside. If you were going to break and enter, you might as well do it in style. To think that they didn't have to get back into the Batmobile and drive tensely through the night again. They had a dozen empty hours ahead of them, open to fill in any way they wanted. She had a fairly good idea of what they would probably choose to do. But the point was the freedom.
Okay,
It
so
felt too
that's going to
good
keep
to be
you
true.
at 2 under for the
So,
round.
naturally, Kevin had to call.
Let's put this
"Hey,
drive in
Danny,
the fairway.
you guys good?" she heard him say. His voice was, as always, penetrating. "I'm excellent," Daniel said. Alex shook her head at him. No need to elaborate. Great. You got to the McKinleys, I presume?" "Yeah, the place hasn't changed." "Good. That means it still belongs to them. Did you get enough rest?" Yes. Thanks for inquiring." Alex sighed, knowing Kevin would never ask just to be polite. Too good to be true, indeed. She held out her hand at the same time that she heard Kevin say, "Let me talk to Oleander." Daniel looked confused, clearly not following, but he handed her the phone. "Let me guess," Alex said. "You need us to join you as soon as possible."
It's looking good?
"Yes." The corners of Daniel's lips turned down. "What did Devers do?" Alex asked. "Nothing. And I don't like it.
About 120
Because of course he's
yards
doing
or so to
something,
the pin from
but
here.
he's being more cautious now. He's not letting me see anything because he guesses that I'm watching. He must be making calls from other people's offices so I can't hear. What did the email say?" She recited it to him word perfect. She'd known he would want the details, so she'd memorized it. "Not bad, Ollie. Not bad. Maybe a little smart for me, but that's okay." "So what are you thinking?" "I want to strike within the week, which means you need to get here and get set to move at the same time." She sighed heavily. "Agreed." "Is the Suburban still there?" I haven't checked yet." "Why not?" he demanded. "I slept in." "You need to toughen up, sweetheart. The beauty sleep can wait for a few weeks." "I'd like to be in top form
3
for
under
this."
for the round.
Yeah. When can you move?" "Where are we going exactly?" "I've got a place for us to crash."
All right.
"Do you have something
Let's
to write
let
with?"
her rip.
He gave her an address. It was in a part of D.C. she wasn't familiar with. She thought the area he was sending them to was in a rather posh part of town, but that didn't fit with her idea of a bolt hole. She must be picturing the wrong neighborhood. She'd been out of the city for a while. "Okay, let me get our stuff together. We'll leave as soon as we can, if we have another car option available. You'll need to stop outside Atlanta sometime after 9 a.m.
Well, it's gonna have
I
to
found
bite.
a place for Lola." "What did you tell them? About the bullet hole in her leg, I mean." "You were in a carjacking. Both you and the dog were injured. You're heading to Atlanta to stay with your mother for a while, but she's allergic. You're very traumatized, and they shouldn't ask about it. Your name is Andy Wells, and they know you'll pay cash. I'm your concerned brother in this scenario, by the way." "Nice." "Of course. Now go check the garage and call me back." "Wilco, sir," she said sarcastically. He hung up on her. "Are we really going to steal the McKinley's car?" Daniel asked. "If we're lucky, yes." He sighed. "Look, we'll leave the Humvee in the garage. It's got to be worth 4 or 5 Suburbans at least. If we aren't able to bring their car back, they won't take a loss, right?" "I suppose. Kevin won't like his favorite plaything being offered as collateral. That part's just the gravy." The house key fit the garage door. Daniel promised that inside and just to the right of the door, next to the light
Sitting
switch,
at
there would be a
4
little hook
under for the
with 2
round.
sets of car keys hanging from it. He flipped the switch. Alex
Okay,
gasped.
it's time to send this
"I've
ball on its
died
way.
and gone to heaven." "Huh. They got a new car," Daniel said, less excited. "I guess the old Suburban must have finally quit." Alex moved around the vehicle, stroking its side with her fingertips. "Look at this, Daniel. Have you ever seen anything more beautiful?" Yes. It's just a silver SUV, Alex. It looks exactly like every third car on the road." "I know. Isn't that fantastic? And look at this." She towed him around the car and pointed to a little chrome plaque
Yeah,
by
you
the
can't hit all the
taillight.
fairways.
He stared at her, totally confused. "It's a hybrid? So..." "It's a hybrid!" she half sang, throwing her arms around him. "This is like Christmas." "I had no idea you were so green." "Psh! You know how many times we're going to have to stop for gas in this thing? Twice! Maybe 3 times. Max. All the way to D.C. And look, just look at those gorgeous plates." She pointed with both hands, part of her noting that she must look like a game show hostess. "Yes, they're Virginia plates. The McKinleys live in Alexandria most of the year, Alex. That's not a huge surprise." "This car is going to be invisible in D.C. It's like a stealth bomber. If anyone manages to follow the trail we left in the Texan Batmobile, they'll hit a dead end now. This is a beautiful thing, Daniel. And I don't think you're fully appreciating what amazing luck this is. I don't like stealing from friends, he grumbled. The McKinleys are nice people? Very nice. They were lovely to my family. So they probably wouldn't want you to die, right? He gave her a dark look. No, probably not. I'm sure if they knew the whole story, they would want you to borrow this car. Borrow implies we're bringing it back. Which of course we will, unless we're dead. Do you think anything but death could keep Kevin from retrieving his favorite ride? Daniel was abruptly much more serious. He folded his arms across his chest and turned to face the car rather than her. Don't joke about that. Alex was a little confused by his mood shift. I'm not actually joking, she clarified. I was trying to make you feel better about taking the car.
You're in the fairway now.
We'll bring it back if we can, I promise. Just don't talk about dying. Not like that, so casually. Oh, sorry, it's just, laugh about it or cry about it. That's the only choice. I'd rather laugh while I can. He looked down at her from the corner of his eye, his posture still rigid for a moment. Then suddenly, he softened, freeing one hand to place it on the side of her face. Maybe we don't do what Kevin wants. Maybe we just stay here. She put her hand over his.
Okay, about an 18-footer here.
We would if we could. They'd find us eventually. He nodded, almost to himself. Okay then, shall we start loading? Sure. Let me call Kevin first. Daniel started shifting bags from the Humvee to the Toyota, while Alex enthused about the car to Kevin. Kevin wasn't much more excited than Daniel, but he got it immediately. That's great, kid. Now hurry up. The clock's ticking. We don't want to get to Atlanta before 9, so we don't need to leave here till, 2 a.m.? All right. So, I'll expect you here around 5 p.m. Counting down the seconds, she gushed facetiously. The car, or the afternoon with Daniel, had put her in an ebullient mood. I'm glad you'll be driving all night, Kevin said. I think I like you better sleep-deprived. With that, he hung up on her again. I should probably walk Einstein, Alex mused.
Go.
Redo Lola's bandages, pack up the food. Then we should try to force ourselves to get a nap. We're flipping our sleeping routine again. I suppose I'm not allowed to walk the dog, Daniel said. Sorry, America's most wanted. My sad little face is better than yours right now, beard or no beard. It's dark out. You sure it's safe for you to go alone? I won't be alone. I'll have a supernaturally intelligent attack dog and a Sig Sauer P220. He almost smiled. Tough luck for the hungry gators. She hid her frown. Alligators. She hadn't been thinking about things like that. Well, she'd stay away from the water, and hopefully Kevin had trained Einstein for more than just human attackers. The walk wasn't long, just enough for Einstein to stretch his legs a little. She couldn't stop thinking about giant reptiles. The road was black, but she didn't want to use a flashlight. She saw no headlights or house lights, heard nothing but swampy noises. It was still hot enough to have the perspiration rolling down her temples, but she was glad she'd brought the hoodie. The mosquitoes were definitely active. When she returned, the Toyota was in front of the house, and the Humvee invisible inside the garage. Daniel had taken care of everything but Lola's dressings. Alex did that, trying to make her work look professional. Hopefully the boarding place would believe a vet had tended her. She stroked Lola's ears, sadly. It would be better for Lola to be somewhere people could take care of her, but Alex would miss her. She wondered what would happen to the dog if they weren't able to come back for her. Lola was beautiful. Someone would want her. Alex remembered imagining taking Lola home with her in some safe, unlikely future. If only. Alex set the alarm clock by the bed for 1:45, but it was obvious that Daniel wasn't interested in stocking up on sleep. We're going to regret this around 8 a.m., she promised him, as his lips trailed down her sternum. I won't ever regret this, he insisted. He was probably right. Given the abbreviated timeline they were working with, it didn't make sense to waste even a second she got to have with him.
4
Happiness
under
with
for
a
the round.
deadline, just like she'd thought before. Only the happiness was greater now, and the deadline
All right,
was crueler.
let's let her rip.
Chapter 23. Alex did manage to get a little bit of sleep, maybe 30 minutes by the time the alarm sounded. Just enough that she was completely dragging as they set off. Daniel was more alert, so he took the first shift and she reclined the passenger seat as far back as it would go. The seats were much more comfortable, the suspension smoother, and it was easier to
This one's a
doze.
beauty.
The dogs seemed happy in the back, as if they appreciated the new ride too. She was herself again by the time they got to the dog boarding facility north of Atlanta. It was after 9:30. They were running a little behind, thanks to some construction delays on I-65. Daniel stayed with the car as she carried Lola into the front office. It was a casual place, homey, with lots of fenced areas lining the road in. The dogs that ran alongside the car as they passed looked happy and healthy. Of course, Lola wouldn't be running anywhere for a while. The man behind the desk was all sympathy as Alex came in. He obviously had linked her to the reservation before she introduced herself as Ms. Wells. She followed patiently as he showed her the spacious kennel Lola would occupy and explained the visiting vet's schedule. She thanked him and paid him for a month in advance, then gave Lola one last hug. As Kevin had promised,
Okay,
the man
so
never
that'll keep
commented
you
on
at
Lola's
4
injury
under
in a
for the
specific
round.
way, and he didn't mention Alex's face. 20 minutes
18th
later,
hole
she
coming
and
up, and
Daniel
then
were
you can
back on the
hang
road.
in the clubhouse. Let's
Alex
see
was
what you can
glad
do
it was
here.
her turn to drive. She needed something to concentrate on so she wouldn't think about leaving Lola behind. She thought Daniel would crash, but he was still bright-eyed and in a talkative mood. Or maybe he could see how she was trying to fight off the sadness and wanted to help. Knowing him, that was probably it. "You know almost everything about me from that stupid file," he complained. "But there's so much I don't know about you." "I've actually told you most of it. When my life wasn't bizarre, it was pretty boring." "Tell me something embarrassing about you in high school." Everything about me was embarrassing in high school. I was a huge nerd. "Sounds sexy." "Oh, really? My mother cut my hair at home, and I had the most outrageous bangs the 90s
Now that
had
was a
ever
swing.
seen." "Please tell me there's a picture." "You wish. When my mother died, I burned all the incriminating stuff." "Who was your first boyfriend?" Alex laughed.
Okay,
"Roger
looks like we have around
Markowitz. He took me to
155
senior prom.
yards to go.
I had the most totally awesome puffy sleeves on my dress. Electric blue, naturally. Roger tried to slip me the tongue in the limo on the way to the ballroom, but he was so nervous that he threw up on me. I spent the whole dance in the ladies' room trying to clean up. I broke up with him that night. One might describe it as an epic romance." "What a tearjerker." "I know. Romeo and Juliet had nothing on us." Daniel laughed. "Who was your first serious relationship?" "Serious? Wow. I don't know if anyone would qualify besides Bradley.
Solid swing.
First year of med school at Columbia." "You went to Columbia Med?" he asked. I was a very brainy nerd. "I'm impressed." Back to Bradley. "Do you want to hear something really and truly embarrassing?" "Very much." "The reason I was first attracted to him?" She paused. "Maybe I shouldn't admit this." "It's too late to turn back. You have to tell me now." She took a deep breath. "Okay, fine. He looked like Egon, you know, from Ghostbusters. Just exactly like that. Bouffant hair, round glasses, everything." Daniel worked to keep a straight face. "Irresistible.
That was
You
a
have
great pitch
no
shot.
idea.
Good job.
So hot." "How long were you together?"
Way to end up
"Through that
with a
first summer.
5 under.
Then I